Before we go to George Weigel, here are some other important stories to share with you. Victims of the Chilean clerical abuse scandal met with Pope Francis this week. The victims said the Pope was open, sympathetic, and deeply impacted by their situation. At one point, Pope Francis admitted to being, quote, part of the problem. Juan Carlos Cruz was one of 3 victims of Chilean abuser Father Fernando Caradima. He said the Holy Father directly apologized and seemed truly sorry. He also felt that the Pope was hurting over his missteps and their pain.
I did tell him that it hurt me tremendously, what he had not said and what he had said when he called us, he called calumnias, lies. And when he, I've been speaking up for years, so has Jimmy, so has Jose Andres. I said to him that it was hard for me to understand that our neighbor from Argentina wouldn't know what was happening.
Meanwhile, in Australia, a judge has ruled that Vatican Cardinal George Pell must stand trial on charges stemming from decades-old allegations of abuse. Magistrate Belinda Wallington dismissed about half of the very serious charges against Cardinal Pell, but decided the prosecution's case was strong enough for the remainder of the charges to warrant a trial. The number of charges and specific details of the cases have not been made public. Pell, who is on leave from his duties at the Vatican, was charged last June with sexually abusing multiple victims in his home state of Victoria. Cardinal Pell has long denied any wrongdoing. This week, he entered a plea of not guilty. The trials are expected to begin within weeks. My next guest has written the definitive biographies of Pope John Paul II, and tonight he joins us to discuss his latest work. In it, he examines the turbulence in America, the Church, and the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's called The Fragility of Order, Catholic Reflections on Turbulent Times. Please welcome back to the show, George Weigel. George, great to see you. George, I want to start with, in the Crux interview with you recently about your new book, you are not alarmed by what you're seeing coming out of Rome and by these synods. Why not?
I'm not as alarmed as some.
Okay.
I think that a lot of ballast was put into the bark of Peter by John Paul II and Benedict XVI, so that this is not 1968 or 1978.
Some would like it to be.
All over again. I'm also encouraged by the fact that Catholic light continues to fail around the world, and the living parts of the Church, wherever you go, North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever, are the parts of the Church that have embraced the magisterium of John Paul II and Benedict XVI as the authentic interpretation of Vatican II, and the moribund or dying or dead parts of the Church, including the German-speaking world, are those that continue to try to make the failed project of Catholic light work. So the empirical evidence is that the ship continues to move forward, although the ship is sailing through some turbulent seas.
Well, and at times the Germans are captaining that ship. Look, Casper really drove the bus along with many of his confreres in Germany. They were at the front end of that family synod that produced Amoris Laetitia. They seem to also be involved in the youth synod. We're seeing what's happening in different parts of their internal community. Let's talk about that. There was a big meeting at the Vatican today. German bishops were supposedly meet with the Pope to come to a decision on whether to grant communion to Protestant spouses of Catholics. It looks like the CDF is sending it back to the bishops and saying, come up in an ecumenical spirit with a unanimous decision that you all can agree on. Is that sufficient to you?
Let's think about the whole German situation. The Church is dying in the German-speaking parts of Europe. Catholic practice is cratering. Vocations are way down. It has always been unclear to me why prominent members of the German hierarchy have been pressing this communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, and now the intercommunion.
Right.
Because these things go on all the time anyway.
Right.
In
Germany.
In Germany. But what we're failing to come to grips with here is what would seem a fairly obvious fact of sacramental theology. It cannot be the case that what is a mortal sin in Poland is a source of grace 2 kilometers away on the other side of the Polish-German border. There's this local option Catholicism is really not very logical. And it's indeed not very sacramental, which is the more important point.
It fractures the universality of the Church, which is its hallmark.
The other thing that I point out in the 2 chapters on the synods in this new book is that very few other bishops were buying the Casper argument in 2014 or 2015. There were 4 different variants of the Casper proposal tried at the Synod of 2015, and none of them received anything remotely approaching a 2/3 endorsement. Then Amoris Laetitia came along and decided to go the ambiguity route in that one famous footnote. But there's no evidence whatsoever that there is, that Casper and his colleagues have won the day in terms of the argument throughout the world church. What has been created is an enormous amount of confusion. But to go back to my original point, the living parts of the church are getting on with living, preaching, offering, proposing what they know to be the truth. And I think a lot of the static that you and I have to endure in the Catholic blogosphere, people are just not paying attention to, and that's just as well, because it'll mess up your head.
Yeah, well, but again, the things that you've spent the large part of your career explaining, collecting for people, holding on to, advancing, the legacy of John Paul, Benedict XVI, the clarity of the council. This is what was meant. This is the official version of what we believe the council taught. That seems to be up for grabs in ways we've never seen before. And I worry about the politicization of it, as Cardinal Burke said earlier, the politicization where we have factions forming, where you've got this group of bishops, and here are 7 other German bishops and Benedict XVI on this side. Why are we in this moment? How did we get here?
I believe that the truth wins, ultimately, because truth has power. And the implausibility of these alternative proposals makes them unlikely to succeed over the long haul. I think it's unfortunate that the Holy Father seems not to understand that Catholic light is not an effective pastoral approach. I completely agree with him that we need to find ways to make these truths more accessible to people and more compelling, and that we need always to meet people where they are. The point is, we don't leave people where they are.
Right.
There's been a lot of talk and a lot of misuse of St. Augustine's image of the ladder of love. Well, we all start pretty low on the ladder, but the point of pastoral accompaniment is to challenge us to rise higher. This is what the living parts of the church understand, and that's why Catholic light ultimately fails.
Let's talk about something that you raise in, and this is a collection of essays that you wrote over a long period of time that you're collecting in the Fragility of Order. You've also written recently about the diversification of the College of Cardinals and how this is problematic because there is not the unity that these men should have. What would be your recommendation?
Well, in my Catholic Press column this week, I said, look, it's a good thing that we have a less Italianate and more universal College of Cardinals. But that only becomes operationally good if they know each other, and they don't. Pope Francis has not called the College of Cardinals together to meet as a body since early 2014, when there was pushback against Cardinal Casper's lecture. This is a very bad idea. So I'm hoping that in the future there will be occasions for these men to meet and get to know each other. My other suggestion in that column is that we should change the rules of the conclave so that once the cardinal electors, those under 80 years old, are locked up in the Vatican, there will be no votes for 3 days. That would give them a chance to take the measure of each other, and it would give the world press a break. It would give a pause. It would lower the temperature. Because as you remember, in 2013, one of the dynamics at work was we've got to get this done quickly to demonstrate the unity of the church.
Right.
And I kept saying, no, what you actually have to do is get it done right.
Right. Demonstrate the competency of the College of Cardinals.
So I think building in a break at the front end of a conclave, at least structurally, creates the conditions for the possibility of a more measured decision.
I was reading the book when I was watching Headlines Cross, and there's a chapter called The Lessons from the Communist Assault on the Church.
Right.
Tell us about that, and I want you to contrast the ideas therein with what we heard from Cardinal Marx this week, which was Karl Marx is this great figure, a revolutionary who's an inspiration, and we wouldn't have the social doctrine of the church without him. Your take?
It was a somewhat striking and indeed bizarre comment. I mean, if what Cardinal Marx meant was that Marx and Engels created a fuss that the church had to
react to,
fine. But in fact, Catholic social doctrine, in its intellectual origins, goes back to a German bishop, Wilhelm Emanuel von Ketteler, whom I assume Cardinal Marx has at least
has
heard
a familiarity
of,
with,
if not read, because Leo XIII said he was the student of von Ketteler when he wrote Rerum Novarum. The real problem today, though, is not one-off comments from Cardinal Marx. The real problem in not learning from this experience of the communist assault on the church in the past is in this reported proposed deal between the Holy See and China.
Yep.
It is an extraordinarily bad idea to let now the Chinese Communist Party, not even the state, but the Chinese Communist Party, nominate bishops. This is an extremely bad idea. It's a violation of canon law. More to the point, it's a violation of the church's own self-understanding.
Right.
This cannot go forward in the form that it now is being discussed without doing grave damage to the evangelical mission of the church in China in the future.
Earlier in the headlines, I reported on Cardinal George Pell, who is head of the Vatican Financial Secretariat. He was swept away, really the second time in his career, on the same charges in some cases. In Australia, he's defending himself. Looks like he'll face 2 trials. These cases, which I've looked in vast detail examined, it seems as if neither of them really have any credibility. One guy is an ex-con. The other, which involves a church and a young person who claims they were abused, one of the guys died. The mother says he told me that Pell didn't do anything. Why is this happening to George Pell, and what is your sense about where this case will end?
I hope and believe it should end in his vindication. There is no truth to any of this. This is a combination of bad police work, bad Australian politics, a judge who did not have, a magistrate, she's not even a judge, did not have the courage to say this is all rubbish, even though she said that on 2 of the charges going forward, I would not vote to convict.
Right.
But a jury should decide. Well, if, come on, if there's not enough there, why are we going forward on this? I wrote last summer, Raymond, at the time when all of this began, that it did not seem to be accidental that this was taking place at the time when Cardinal Pell, who is literally my oldest friend in the world, we met in 1967, was getting down to some very serious financial corruption involving various forces around the world, but specifically in Italy. And I still continue to think that it's not an accident, that there is some connection
that these
between
charges were
his work
revived.
in Rome, or ginned up,
Right.
or simply ginned
The
up.
timing is curious.
The
because
timing is instructive.
Let's move on to Regensburg, which you talk about in the book. Of course, I remember covering this live, and it was an astounding, when you saw that full Regensburg address of Benedict XVI in context, it was an amazing, brilliant critique and challenge to the Islamic world. Have they responded? There were some back and forth, some dialogue. Have they responded to the questions he really posed?
I was at a meeting in Rome this past December, organized by the Religious Freedom Institute here in Washington, a dialogue between Christian and Islamic scholars and jurists. And I think there has been some forward progress. The point that Pope Benedict made, or one of the points that he made, that Islam has to find within its own philosophical, religious, legal resources an Islamic argument for religious toleration. I think there are some signs that that's beginning to happen. And the talk I gave at that conference in Rome in December, when I explained this is what the Catholic Church had to go through. We had to recover some lost elements in our own tradition in order to get to the Second Vatican Council. And the Declaration on Religious Freedom is now being circulated among Islamic jurists and scholars, and may even have gotten to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who seems at least intellectually interested in these problems. So it's not fast progress, but I think the more reflective parts of that world understand that they've got a big problem, and perhaps we might be of some help to them in solving it. For Islam to come to grips with religious toleration and with social pluralism does not necessarily mean a wholesale surrender to modernity, any more than the Catholic Church's coming to grips with religious freedom and separation of church and state involved a wholesale surrender to modernity.
Before I let you go, your perspective and insight on this synodality we've been seeing, where the Pope calls synods to hash out and argue in a public way doctrine, pastoral practice, particularly pastoral practice, as regards the family, and now we have this youth synod coming in the fall on youth and vocation. Given what you've seen in the preparatory just a few weeks ago, and that document the bishops will be using to guide their discussions, do you have high hopes for this synod?
I don't think anyone has figured out how to make the Synod of Bishops work since it first met in 1967. And it's frankly not working very well now. The Synod General Secretariat has a very specific point of view that it tries to forward. It's not reluctant to throw a few elbows in getting that point of view.
So you've written,
advanced.
You believe they manipulated.
Yeah, they obviously did, and it's ludicrous for Cardinal Baldessari to say, as he did recently, that there was no contention at these synods. I mean, I didn't imagine what I saw in front of my eyes in October 2015. I think it does, these things do identify issues that require serious conversation, but most of the serious conversation at synods takes place during the coffee breaks, lunch, dinner, and in what I call the off-Broadway parts of the synod. And that's not bad. I mean, this is an important, I've met people during the off-Broadway parts of synods that have genuinely filled out my understanding of different parts of the world church, and I hope I've been of some help to them. So that's good stuff. But the actual process itself is not terribly productive. And then, of course, what came out of the Synod of 2015 was not what was written, at least in full, in Amoris Laetitia. So the relationship between the Synod and the teaching authority of the Pope remains something else to be sorted out.
And this youth synod, what do you think it will ultimately focus on? I mean, there's a lot of, the document itself is self-contradictory. We want church teaching to change. We relish a recapitulation of church teaching and a more vibrant call to holiness. So it contradicts itself throughout the document.
What I hope happens is that the bishops, who are the Synod Fathers, meet probably in the off-Broadway parts of the Synod. A lot of Catholic youth ministries that actually work. I have seen the draft of the working document for the Synod, the so-called Instrumentum Laboris. There is not a single reference in it to a vital, vibrant Catholic youth ministry. There's all of this stuff about how difficult it is to hear what the church teaches, but there's no reflection on the people who have heard it
and are doing it,
and are embodying it, and are living it joyfully, and are offering it to others. So there's a bit too much self-deprecation going on here, I think. And frankly, it doesn't work. I mean, young people are not interested in a church that kowtows to them.
No.
The genius of John Paul II was that he challenged young people.
Yeah.
In a world that panders to them, he challenged them. He challenged them with compassion. He said, look, I mean, you're not going to do it right all the time.
Right.
Seek reconciliation and forgiveness and try again. But don't ever settle for anything less than the spiritual and moral grandeur that the grace of God makes possible in your life. I want to see that said at Synod 2018.
Right.
But the early returns are not looking too
Not looking
good.
hopeful. Yeah, well, that line about you were made to set yourself apart from the world. That notion that John Paul put forward, and you talk about accompaniment. Who accompanied young people better than John Paul II in his personal ministry and then as Pope? I mean, it was a spectacular thing to witness, and one that, I'll be frank, I watch sometimes and go, what is he doing? Yeah. Why is he doing this? Now you see why he was doing it. He was planting seeds that now are blossoming. But why aren't we listening and looking at that example, George? Whether it's Familias Consortio or it's his approach to the young, it's like the pontificate never happened.
Well, let's even look at an American organization here. Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University
Curtis Martin's great
is
group.
one of the most successful and important Catholic youth ministries in the world. It is a direct outgrowth of World Youth Day 1993 in Denver. Where is that experience in this Synod reflection? I'm going to try to make sure that it's at least conceptually there in my own writing about this this fall. But surely Curtis Martin and his colleagues are people that anyone interested in youth ministry that's effective would want to talk to.
Right. Right, and hear their voices and their lived experience, which is valuable and continuing to draw young people today. George Weigel, thank you for being here. The Fragility of Order, Catholic Reflections on Turbulent Times is in bookstores everywhere. Thank you for being here. And the book is also at the EWTN Religious Catalog and wherever books are sold.